The whole next day, Katie had to sit in the timeout chair. It's where bad kids had to sit. And Katie knew she wasn't a bad kid. Even though Mrs. Henry thought so sometimes. And what if Santa thought so, too? What if there weren't any presents on Christmas morning? Katie thought and thought. She figured that Tiffany was probably her secret Santa. And even if Tiffany hated her, Tiffany was perfect. Katie thought perfect Tiffany would probably bring perfect presents. Maybe she'd even bring Katie a Tea Party castle set. Katie snuck a look at Tiffany. She had to stretch forward to do it, since the timeout chair was way in back. Tiffany was sitting up straight and tall, doing the spelling test. She didn't look as if she was thinking about being a secret Santa at all. She didn't look like she was worried about the spelling words, either. Katie sighed and looked at her paper. She was taking the spelling test, too. Everybody was. And she hated spelling. She looked over at the rabbits in their cage. She couldn't see well from here. She folded her legs under her and rose up, but still couldn't see. She had snuck Ken out again that morning, when no one was looking. He was just the softest rabbit to hold. But she'd had trouble getting the bar back in place, just like the day before. "Are you paying attention, Katie?" Mrs. Henry said now. Katie unfolded her legs. She slid down in her seat and looked at her paper. "The next word is Hanukkah," Mrs. Henry said. Katie sighed. The hardest word in the world. She frowned at her paper. She chewed on her pencil. She knew you were supposed to sound out a word if you weren't sure of it. She tried sounding it silently to herself. Han. A-K-A. She frowned at it. She wrote it out. Hanukkah. It didn't look right. Maybe it was a hard C instead of a K. She erased the K and put in a C. Hanukkah. Katie shrugged. She looked up at Mrs. Henry and waited for the next word. But Mrs. Henry was looking funny. She was frowning at something. "Boys and girls," she said. "Did anyone take Barbie or Ken out of their cage?" Right away, everybody looked at the rabbit's cage. Katie kneeled in her seat again. Then she stood up. Barbie, the gray rabbit, was in the cage. The door was a little way open. And Ken, the white rabbit, was not there. Her fault. She hadn't locked the cage tight. She could feel her heart thumping hard. "Ken's gone," Emil said. "Yes," Mrs. Henry said. "I noticed." Mrs. Henry quickly stood up. She went to the classroom door and closed it tight. Then she crossed the room and closed the door of the cage. Katie could hear the bar slide across. "Now, boys and girls," Mrs. Henry said. "I want you to turn your spelling tests face down on your desks. And then let's look everybody. Get under the desks, go in the coat closet, look in the reading corner. He's got to be in here somewhere." Everybody jumped up and started looking. Katie slid under the desk. She knew rabbits couldn't climb. She started crawling under all the desks. "Here, rabbit, here, rabbit," she called softly. "Oh please, oh please, oh please." She looked all around. No rabbit. She crawled on her hands and knees all the way across the room, looking. Still no Ken. But she met Obi under Tiffany's desk. He was down on all fours, too. "Hi, Obi," she said. "Arf," he said back. He pretended to wag a pretend tail. Katie sat back on her heels. "Why are you being a dog?" she said. "Because dogs chase rabbits," Obi said. "Arf, arf." "Oh," Katie said. "But I don't see any rabbits." "Me neither," Obi said. They both looked around. Half the class was crawling around on the floor. The other half were in the coat closet. Katie could hear them giggling and talking. It wasn't funny, though. What if Ken had hopped out of the room? What if he had disappeared just like the gerbils had disappeared? What if it was all her fault? Tiffany was standing over by the rabbit's cage. "Mrs. Henry," she called out. Katie was playing with the rabbits before. "I saw her. Maybe she let Ken out." Mrs. Henry looked over at Katie. "You didn't take him out of the cage, did you, Katie?" she said. "No," Katie said. She could feel her face get hot. She had taken him out. But she had put him back. "Are you sure?" Mrs. Henry said. "Sure, I'm sure," Katie said. Her face was burning hot. "It's all right. I believe you," Mrs. Henry said. She smiled. Katie didn't smile back. She made a very frowny face. She was glad, though, that Mrs. Henry believed her. Even if she hadn't told the truth. Exactly. Katie looked all around the room. Everybody was busy looking. Tiffany and Emil Marks were turning over pillows in the reading corner. Suddenly Katie had a thought. She knew it was a bad thought. But nobody would know. And it wouldn't hurt Tiffany. Katie took another quick look around. No one was looking at her. None of the kids. Not even Mrs. Henry. Mrs. Henry and even Obi had gone to the coat closet. Very quietly, Katie stood up. She turned over Tiffany's spelling paper. She looked at the very last word. Hanukkah. Hanukkah. She said it over and over to herself. She knew it was right because Tiffany did everything right, even spelling. She put the paper face down on Tiffany's desk again. She went over to her desk. She looked around one more time. Still nobody looking. She erased Hanukkah. She wrote in Hanukkah. She put her paper back on her desk. Her heart was pounding hard. But she again took a deep breath. Nobody would know. Nobody at all. Not even Santa Claus. She hoped.